Richard Crawford sat trapped in his luxury car as floodwaters rose around him, the storm having turned the quiet Texas road into a raging river in minutes. The billionaire CEO, who controlled boardrooms and commanded empires, was now completely powerless against nature's fury. His phone was dead. His driver had been swept away trying to get help. Richard was alone, water rising to his chest, when a beat-up pickup truck appeared through the torrential rain. A woman he'd never met was about to risk everything to save him. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Richard Crawford was 52 years old, the founder and CEO of Crawford Industries, worth over $3 billion. He'd built his empire on determination, ruthlessness, and the belief that weakness had no place in business or life. His company manufactured everything from medical devices to technology components. He was respected, feared, and utterly alone in his success. Tonight, Richard had been driving back from inspecting a new factory site in rural Texas when the storm hit. Weather reports had warned of flash flooding, but Richard never let weather dictate his schedule. His driver, Tom, had been nervous about the rising water on the back roads, but Richard had insisted they press on. He had a board meeting in the morning. Time was money. Delay was weakness. Then the road disappeared beneath them. What had been a shallow stream crossing turned into a violent torrent in seconds. The car hydroplane spun and slammed into a tree. Tom had tried to open his door to assess the situation, but the current ripped him from the vehicle immediately, sweeping him downstream before Richard could even shout a warning. Now Richard sat alone in the back seat of his armored luxury sedan, built to withstand bullets but not floods. Water poured through the seams, rising steadily. He tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge against the water pressure. He tried the windows, but they were stuck. The car's emergency features had failed. Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Pure, visceral fear. He was going to die. Here, alone, in a flooded car on a back road in Texas. All his wealth, all his power, all his success, none of it mattered. He couldn't buy his way out of this. The water reached his neck. Richard tilted his head back, gasping for the last pocket of air near the roof of the car. His mind flashed through his life, his ex-wife, his estranged daughter, the employees he'd fired without a second thought, the charities he'd donated for tax breaks rather than genuine care. What had it all been for? Then, through the rain-streaked window, he saw headlights. An old pickup truck pulled up on the slightly higher ground nearby. Richard's heart surged with hope. Someone had stopped. Someone had seen him. A figure jumped out of the truck, small, moving with purpose through the violent storm. Richard couldn't make out details through the rain and darkness, but he could see the person tying a rope around their waist, securing the other end of the truck. Then the figure waded into the rushing water, fighting against the current toward his car. It was a woman. Richard could see that now. She was young, maybe early 30s, wearing jeans and a soaked flannel shirt. Her dark hair was plastered to her face. She moved with determination, using the rope to steady herself against the current. She reached his car and cupped her hands against the window, peering in. Their eyes met, his filled with desperate fear, hers with fierce determination. She pointed to the back window and made a smashing motion. The woman pulled a hammer from her belt and swung hard at the back window. It took 3 hits before the glass shattered. Water immediately rushing faster, but it also equalized the pressure. The woman reached through, unlocking the door from the inside. "Grab my hand," she shouted over the roar of the flood. Richard reached for her. Their hands clasped. She pulled with surprising strength, helping him squeeze to the back door opening. The moment he was free, the current grabbed them both. But the rope held. The woman wrapped her arm around Richard's chest and began pulling them both hand over hand along the rope back toward her truck. It was the longest 30 seconds of Richard's life. The water tried to tear them apart. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. But the woman held him, pulled him, saved him. They collapsed on a muddy bank near her truck, both gasping for air. The woman immediately checked him over for injuries, her hands quick and efficient. "Can you walk? We need to get to higher ground. The water's still rising." Richard nodded, too exhausted to speak. She helped him to his feet and into her truck. As they drove away, Richard looked back just in time to see his luxury car completely submerged, then swept away downstream like a toy. The woman who saved him never even asked his name. The woman drove them to a small emergency shelter set up in a church on higher ground. The sanctuary was filled with other flood victims. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers clutching scared dogs. Red Cross volunteers moved through the crowd with blankets and hot coffee. Richard sat on a folding chair, wrapped in a donated blanket that smelled like mothballs, watching his rescuer. She'd immediately gone to help others, finding blankets for families, comforting frightened children, helping volunteers coordinate rescue information. A Red Cross worker stopped by Richard's chair. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Richard managed. "The woman who brought me here, who is she?" "That's Elena Martinez. Local nurse. She's been driving the back road since the storm started, pulling people out of trouble. Saved at least 6 people tonight that I know of. Won't take a break, won't rest. That's just who she is." Richard watched Elena kneeling beside an elderly woman, gently checking her blood pressure, speaking softly to calm her fears. Everything about Elena spoke of competence, compassion, and selfless service. Later, when the immediate crisis calmed, Richard approached Elena. She was sitting on the church steps, finally taking a moment to rest, drinking water from a paper cup. Her clothes were still damp, her hair tangled, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I never thank you properly," Richard said. "You saved my life." Elena looked up, seeming to really see him for the first time. "You're welcome. I'm glad I got there in time. Is your driver okay? I saw he got swept away." Richard's throat tightened. "I don't know. They're still searching." "I'm sorry," Elena said simply. "These floods are devastating. 3 people confirmed dead so far, a dozen missing. The rain's not supposed to stop for another 6 hours." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Richard asked, "Why did you risk your life for me?" "You don't know me. I could have been anyone." Elena gave him a puzzled look. "That's exactly why I helped you. You were someone in trouble. That's enough. But you could have died. That current was strong enough to." "But I didn't die," Elena interrupted gently. "And neither did you. That's what matters." Richard studied this woman who'd risked everything for a stranger. "What you did was extraordinary. Most people would have driven past, called 911 and kept going. 911 couldn't get there in time. You would have drowned," Elena said matter-of-factly. "Besides, helping isn't extraordinary. It's just being human." Over the next few hours, as the storm continued, Richard learned Elena's story. She was a single mother working as an ER nurse at the local hospital. She'd grown up in this community, where people looked out for each other. Her father had been a volunteer firefighter who died rescuing people during a tornado when Elena was 16. She'd learned from him that service to others wasn't optional. It was essential. He used to say, "We don't save people because we expect something back. We save them because that's what makes us human," Elena said, her voice soft with memory. Richard felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. He'd spent decades building wealth, but when had he last helped someone without calculating what he'd gain? When had he last seen a stranger as a person rather than an obstacle or opportunity? His phone had dried enough to turn on. Messages flooded in, his assistant, his lawyers, his daughter. Richard ignored them all. He sat in this church shelter, surrounded by people who'd lost everything, and felt ashamed of the life he'd been living. "Elena," Richard said, "I'm Richard Crawford. I run Crawford Industries. When this is over, I want to help your community rebuild. Whatever you need." "We need volunteers," Elena interrupted. "We need people willing to get muddy helping clean up. We need folks who'll show up and work. Money's helpful, but hands and hearts are what we need most." Richard had never been told his money wasn't enough. He'd never been told that what he could offer wasn't the most valuable thing. It was humbling and clarifying at once. "Then I'll give you both," Richard said. "My hands, my heart, and my money." Elena smiled. "That's the best offer I've heard all day." For the next 2 weeks, Richard Crawford did something he'd never done in his entire adult life. He stayed. He didn't rush back to his boardroom. He didn't delegate the recovery to his assistant. He stayed in Texas, worked alongside Elena and the community, and learned what it meant to truly help people. He shoveled mud out of homes. He hammered drywall. He sorted donations at the relief center. He wore borrowed clothes and worked until his muscles ached. His manicured hands developed blisters and calluses. His expensive watch was replaced with a cheap waterproof one that could handle the work. His board called constantly, "Mr. Crawford, we need you here. The shareholders are concerned. This isn't appropriate for a CEO." Richard ignored them. For the first time in 30 years, something was more important than business. He worked alongside Elena daily. She taught him about the people whose homes they were rebuilding. The retired teacher who'd lost all her photo albums. The young family whose 3-year-old daughter had been terrified since the flood. The elderly veteran who'd lost his service dog in the current. Each person had a story. Each person mattered. Richard had spent years seeing people as metrics, employees, consumers, shareholders. Now he saw them as humans. One afternoon, while helping rebuild a porch, Elena asked, "Why are you still here, Richard? I'm sure you have important business to get back to." Richard set down his hammer. "I'm starting to realize that nothing I do back there is more important than what I'm doing right here." "That's a big shift for a billionaire CEO," Elena said with a slight smile. "It's a big shift for me," Richard admitted. "Before the flood, I thought success meant accumulating wealth and power. I thought caring about others was weakness unless it served a business purpose. He paused, the truth painful to admit. I was empty. I had everything and nothing at the same time. And now I'm eating donated sandwiches, sleeping on a church cot, and rebuilding a stranger's porch. And I've never felt more alive." Elena nodded. "That's what service does. It reminds us who we really are underneath all the stuff we use to define ourselves." That night, Richard received a call from his daughter, Amy, who he hadn't spoken to in over a year. She'd seen news coverage of the flood and recognized him working in the background of relief footage. "Dad, what are you doing?" "The news says you've been in Texas for 2 weeks helping with flood relief." "I have been," Richard confirmed. "But why?" "That's not like you." Richard felt that truth cut deep. His own daughter expected him to care only about business. "Amy, I almost died in that flood. A woman named Elena risked her life to save me, a complete stranger. She didn't know I was wealthy or important. She just knew I needed help. And after she saved me, she immediately went to help others. No expectation of reward or recognition, just service." He paused, emotion thick in his throat. "I realize I spent your entire life teaching you, by my example, that money and success are what matter most, that caring about others is secondary to achievement. And I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I want to be different. I want to be the kind of father you're proud of, not just the kind who's successful." Amy was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, "Can I come help with the relief work?" Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I'd love that, sweetheart. I'd really love that." The next day, Amy arrived. Richard introduced her to Elena, and together they worked side by side, father and daughter rebuilding homes and their relationship simultaneously. Elena watched them with knowing eyes. "You know what the best thing about disasters is?" she asked one evening as they took a break. "What?" "They strip away everything false, every pretense, every mask. They show us who we really are and who we really want to be. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what actually matters." Richard looked at his daughter, laughing as she painted a wall with a group of teenagers. He looked at his blistered hands, his muddy clothes, his complete lack of wealth and power on display, and he felt grateful. Genuinely, deeply grateful. "Thank you, Elena," Richard said, "not just for saving my life, for showing me how to live it." 6 months later, Richard stood at the dedication ceremony for the new Crawford Community Center in Elena's hometown. But unlike every other building that bore his name, this one hadn't been built by his company for profit. This one had been built with his hands, with donations he'd personally raised, and with a purpose beyond business. The center will provide medical care, disaster preparedness training, and community resources. Everything Elena and her town had needed but couldn't afford. Richard had restructured his entire company's charitable arm, redirecting millions toward direct community impact rather than tax-advantaged donations. Elena stood beside him at the ribbon cutting, wearing her nurse's scrubs because she'd come straight from her hospital shift. The contrast between them was stark. The billionaire in his designer suit and the nurse in her work clothes. But they stood as equals, united by purpose. "I still can't believe you named it after yourself," Elena teased gently. "That seems contrary to everything you've learned." Richard smiled. "I named it Crawford, so every time I see it or hear about it, I remember the night I almost died and the woman who taught me that wealth without service is worthless. It's a reminder of who I want to be." The ceremony began. Local officials spoke. Community members thanked Richard for his generosity. But when it was Richard's turn to speak, he did something unexpected. He called Elena to the microphone. "6 months ago, this woman pulled me out of a flooded car," Richard said to the gathered crowd. "She risked her life for a stranger. She didn't know I was wealthy. She didn't expect anything in return. She just helped because someone needed help. That night changed my life more than any business deal or achievement ever has." Richard turned to Elena. "You taught me that the measure of a person isn't what they accumulate, but what they give. That power means nothing if it's not used to serve others. That a life spent pursuing only personal success is a life wasted." He looked back at the crowd. "I've restructured my company to prioritize community impact over profit margins. I've trained my employees in disaster response. I've committed my wealth to building centers like this one in communities that need them. And I've rebuilt my relationship with my daughter, who's now working full-time in our community service division." Amy stood in the crowd, beaming with pride. Richard met her eyes, and they shared a moment of healing and hope. "But most importantly," Richard continued, "Elena taught me that we're all just one disaster away from needing help. That the walls we build between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, important and insignificant, they're illusions. When the flood came, my luxury car and my billions couldn't save me. Only another human being's courage and compassion could do that." Richard's voice grew thick with emotion. "I spent 50 years building an empire while forgetting to build a legacy. Elena reminded me that the only legacy worth leaving is the lives we've touched and the people we've helped. Everything else is just stuff." After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and toured the new center, Elena and Richard stood together on the porch. "You've changed a lot of lives with the center," Elena said. "You should be proud." "I learned from the best," Richard said. "You've been changing lives your whole life. I'm just following your example." Elena smiled. "You know what my dad used to say? We're all broken people saving broken people. That's what community means. Your father was a wise man. He would have liked you. The new you." Richard looked at the center, at the people streaming in and out, at the possibility and hope it represented. "Thank you, Elena, for saving me twice, once from the flood and once from myself." Elena hugged him, this unlikely friendship born from disaster and forged in service. "We saved each other, Richard. That's what humans do. We save each other." As Richard drove away that evening, he thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, the one who would have driven past someone in trouble, the one who measured life in dollars rather than impact, the one who'd been drowning long before the flood ever came. Elena had pulled him from the water, but she'd also pulled him from a life that was killing him slowly, from the belief that wealth and power were enough, from the loneliness of success without service. Richard looked at his hands on the steering wheel. Still slightly callous from the rebuilding work he continued to do every month, he thought about Amy, working alongside him now rather than resenting him from a distance. He thought about the communities they were helping, the lives they were touching, the legacy they were building. And he understood something profound. The flood hadn't taken his life. It had given him one, a real one worth living. His phone rang. It was Elena. "Hey, Richard. We have another storm system moving through next week. Might cause flooding. Can you have your team on standby to help with evacuations?" "Already coordinating it," Richard said. "Amy and I will be there too." "See you then." And Richard, thank you for showing up, not just with money, but with your hands and heart. Elena, I'm the one who should be thanking you. Then let's just call it even, Elena said with a laugh. See you next week. Richard hung up and smiled. His old self would have sent a check and considered his obligation fulfilled. His new self knew that showing up meant more than showing wealth, that hands and hearts mattered more than bank accounts. He'd learned that lesson in the worst and best moment of his life. Trapped in a flooded car, saved by a stranger who became a friend, transformed by a disaster that stripped away everything false and shown him what was real. Years later, when people asked Richard Crawford about his greatest achievement, he never mentioned his billions or his business empire. He talked about a stormy night in Texas, a brave nurse in a pickup truck, and the moment he'd stopped drowning his old life and learned to truly live. He'd talk about the day he'd almost died and discovered what it meant to be alive. The day he'd lost everything that didn't matter and found everything that did. Because sometimes life doesn't bring us disasters to destroy us. It brings them to save us from ourselves, from our illusions, from lives lived in pursuit of the wrong things. Elena had pulled Richard from a flood. But more than that, she'd pulled him toward purpose, toward service, toward the understanding that we're all connected, all vulnerable, all in need of each other. And that understanding, that transformation, that moment of truth in churning water and pouring rain, that was worth more than all the billions Richard had ever accumulated. Because when the flood came, money couldn't save him. Only human compassion could do that. Only someone willing to risk everything for a stranger. Only someone who understood that saving others is what makes us human. Elena had shown him that truth. And Richard had spent the rest of his life living it. Not because he owed her, but because she'd shown him who he could be, who he wanted to be, who he finally was. A man who'd been saved not once, but twice. Once from drowning, and once from a life that wasn't worth saving, until he learned to make it worth something by serving others. That's not just survival. That's transformation. That's what happens when disaster strips away everything false and shows us what's real. And what's real is simple. We need each other. We save each other. We're all connected by our vulnerability and our capacity to help. That's the lesson Richard learned in a flood. That's the truth Elena had known all along. And that's the legacy they built together, not in steel and stone, but in lives touched, people helped, and communities served. Because in the end, we don't remember people for what they accumulated. We remember them for what they gave, for who they helped, for how they showed up when others needed them. Richard Crawford had learned that lesson the hard way, but he'd learned it well, and he'd spent the rest of his life teaching to others, not through words, but through actions, because that's what Elena had taught him. That's what her father had taught her, and that's what we all need to remember. We're all just one disaster away from needing help, and we're all just one choice away from being the help someone desperately needs. The flood had taught Richard Crawford that truth. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps us share more beautiful stories like this one. Kindly drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I like to know what part of the world engages with my story. Oh, also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel Deep Cut Stories for more emotional stories about love, kindness, and fate that'll touch your heart deeply. Thank you for watching.